Okay, I'm turning my microphone off now, okay?
Okay. Good afternoon. Today, I'm going to give an example of what I was talking about last time, the way in which grammaticalization and constructionalization can complement each other. So far, I think I've been somewhat abstract. Today, there will be quite a bit of data and a lengthy set of examples. My examples, trying to I'm sorry, having a bit of trouble getting this. Okay. Well, it keeps skipping. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 semi-modals in English. They are had better, as in you'd better take some water with you because it's hot. Had rather, as in bumper sticker that people tend to have around here. I'd rather be fishing, saying I prefer to fish than to be driving. And I'd sooner do this than that. And I'm going to look at their history and at a grammaticalization account that has been given of their history, suggest a construction account. This will get me into some initial discussion of networks. And then I will compare the grammaticalization and constructionalization approach to these semi-modals. Now, you might be wondering why this rather obscure set of semi-modals would be the topic of a lecture. They have, in fact, a number of very interesting properties historically, and they have been looked at in some detail. There's been synchronic studies, several of them, but there's been a set of historical studies, one by David Dennison with Dennison and Court of 2010 on better, and I'll talk about that later. The basic idea is that the adjective better gets reanalyzed as an adverb, probably by analogy with rather and sooner. And it's an interesting proposition that we will discuss. Then Van der Alvera has discussed better in various varieties of English, and Van der Alvera and de Wit have discussed rather. Their work is primarily quantificational, and they've been interested in the fact that these 3 semi-modals co-occur with different kinds of modals, like had, would, should, and each one is somewhat different. When they're reduced to ud, of course, we cannot distinguish should and would, and that's one of their topics of interest. And Van Linden, and she's the one I'm really going to talk about most, discusses all 3, as I have. And though I entirely agree with some of her points about grammaticalization, I'm going to suggest some alternative ways of looking at the data. The capital letters, by the way, group together the variants ud, had, or in the case of better, 0. You better go is just as good as you'd better go. They are particularly interesting because here we have a set of modals that are not verbs, and they don't behave like verbs except in certain ways that I will discuss. Questions have been asked about whether they form a set, what a constructional account can add to a grammaticalization account or a development. And I'm going to ask those questions and think about whether there's evidence that they have been analogized, not only to rather and sooner and each other, but also to the larger modal construction. And the question about whether they form a set gives us the opportunity to think initially about networks and families of constructions. I'm going to be discussing networks further. Somebody asked some weeks ago about how one deals with variation. I'm not going to address that today, but I will next time in terms of networks. I am contextualizing the developments of these three, better, sooner, and rather, in the context of the concept of emerging modals. Manfred Krug in 2000 wrote a book discussing ongoing changes to the modal system. He did not discuss the semi-modals I'm going to discuss. He did discuss be going to, ought to, want to, have to as a set of emerging modals that are morphologically distinct from the core modals will, shall, may, must, could, should, and might. And this turns out to be quite relevant to the modals that I'm talking about here. He also talks about dare, need to, and ought to, oscillating between central modal and emerging modal behavior. Can you have ought to? Yes, I think you can. Can you have daren't to? No, probably not. So you say dare not to or don't dare to. How do you do a negative question with ought? Did you ought to do it? It's quite difficult because these semi-modals don't, in fact, meet the criteria of core modals or of main verbs. They're sort of in between. And so I'm going to pose the question to what extent we can think of better, rather, and sooner as part of this new emerging system. Dennison and Court say of the set better, rather, and sooner that they are a group of phrasal items of similar shape. That is absolutely true. Van Linden has suggested that they are a set, and Van der Avere and de Wit say it is a class. And they have pointed out, and I think they're right, that these are marginal subtypes of the deontic obligation modals in English. They have something to do with whether one is not only preferring something, but whether one would be better off doing something or would be advised to be doing something. So they're not actually concerned with strict obligation, but rather with the side of the modal system that has to do with what others should or might be doing. And Van Linden has argued that although better grammaticalized along a different path than rather and sooner, they're all grammaticalizing in the same direction. And I have argued that constructionally they're actually diverging, but they do form a related family. So let's see what some examples are. In present day English, better is by far the most frequent of three. I'll come back to that point. He never turned up, so about 9 o'clock I said, I'd better phone the police. Something that I advised to do that I feel obligated to do. Gretchen, you had better be right, or there's going to be trouble. This better is an advice modal. I advise you that you better be right, that you should be right, or otherwise there's going to be bad consequences. If I hadn't called the police, there would have been bad consequences. I would have been responsible for neglecting the person who didn't show up. Now, in the case of better, the subject of the auxiliary had is the subject of the verb. You cannot get things like, I'd better you phone, where the subject is I, and the subject of phone is you. So you have to have same subject for auxiliary and verb. And the other thing to say about better at this point is that better does not have a standard of comparison. So you can't say, I'd better do X than Y in contemporary English. Rather is rather different. I mean, don't hesitate to come back, because at the end of the day, I'd rather you know too much than not enough. Well, here are some structural differences that are very obvious from better. I'll give you the other example before discussing those. You'd rather just kind of sail out a conquering hero, but no, not me, not my style. This is a preference model, and really doesn't have anything to do with the speaker. It's the subject who prefers. If I was to say, you'd better just kind of sail out, I, speaker, am advising. When I say you'd rather just kind of sail out, I'm talking about you, second person, preferring. Now, as you can see from 2a, the subject of the auxiliary, which is would or had or would in modern English, can be different from the subject of the verb. So I'd rather you know too much than not enough. That was not possible with better. And the standard of comparison then is often given as a typo there. It should be 2a. I'd rather you know too much than not enough. Can't say you better know too much than not enough. Now, sooner is the least frequent and is very much like rather. He wanted 12 shillings. I said we'd sooner sleep under the hedges. I think you'd sooner join the ladies' league than gun a guy down. This is a preference modal, just like rather is. And again, the subject, not the speaker, prefers. And again, the subject of the auxiliary can be different from the subject of the verb. A standard of comparison is usually given. Join the ladies' league than. I know it's written then, but that's meant to be kind of colloquial spelling. Then gun a guy down. And unlike rather, its temporal origin is still transparent in present-day English. I have skipped one there. All right. Talking about the history. I'm going to start with rather, as its source appears in the data first. We find in Old English, which was somewhere between 650 to 1100, the precursor of rather as a temporal. It was rather, quickly, straight away. And it meant sooner, and it also meant instead. I'd rather do this than that, is the modern version. Put this Okay, so that's more quickly. By Middle English, you're going to mean preferably. And I think you can see that semantic change there quite readily. If you think that time is important, sooner is better than later. So you prefer sooner. And this preference reading develops in the context of a modal, and only in the context of the modal. And the modal at that time was will or would or should. There is no had around 1300. Rather, ich wollte hang be a court. Rather, I would hang by a rope and do something else. I am no thief to break my oath. Rather, I would hang by a rope. I would prefer to. And here you got would. It's quite well established as a modal by the end of the 16th century, with both would and had, which came in around 1500. And if you look at these kinds of examples, paraphrases such as would prefer it, it would be better if seem appropriate for examples like, I would rather be torn with wild horses than forsake my religion. In Shakespeare's plays, so around 1600, there are 60 examples of I had rather be, with pronominals and nominal objects. That suggests to me that rather was constructionalized as a modal by Shakespeare's time. You have a new form, which is adjacent to the modal, and a new meaning a preference modal. Now that took some time to come into being because we started out with would and should, and then we acquired had, and it eventually became entrenched around 1600. You've probably noticed that it is used with negative semantic prosody. The term for being preferred with either a negation or a semantically negative verb, such as die or be torn, these examples. I'd rather be torn with wild horses than forsake my religion. You can get things like, I'd rather be happy than sad, but that is rather unusual. It's much more common to have it, at this period at least, with negative prosody for main verbs. Now, modal sooner appears in later Middle English, so it appears later than rather. Like rather, it's temporal in origin, and it tends to be used in negative semantic contexts. For God will sooner hear many poor people rightfully crying vengeance than a Lord and many hypocrites. I take the negative context there to be poor people who crying vengeance. And again, I think we find here that we've got a constructionalization, a new form, adjacency with modals, and a new meaning, a preference modal, rather than the temporal reading. Now, what about better? Better in Middle English, according to Denison and Court, was an adjective used in a subjunctive, impersonal copula construction. 7 is about what the narrator assesses would be literally and objectively better for a father, given Christian tradition and the mores of the time. Mon were better for his son be sorry. That is an impersonal, it's for a man, it would be better for his son. A man there doesn't have any inflection on it anymore because we're in the middle of Middle English, but that is essentially a dative. A man would be better, for a man would be better for his son to be sorry and unshriven than shriven without sorriness. So it would be better for a man if his son was sorry and not received the sacrament than to receive the sacrament without being sorry. That is adjective, better, in a subjunctive among were, it were better, not it is better, it were better, and it's impersonal because a man is essentially dative there. But impersonals were lost in English during Middle English. There were very many of them in Old English. There were things like me is thirsty, me thinks. There were two verbs of thinking. One of them, me thinks, is it seems to me. And since there were no impersonals anymore, one thing that speakers could have done is simply stopped using better. But they did not do that. Instead, they apparently analogized better with a comparative adverb. You can do that very easily in English because in English, there are many adjective adverb pairs, like run fast. The adverb in Old English was fast with an E on the end, but the E had got lost by Middle English. So it was very easy in formal terms for an adjective to be used as an adverb. A lot of people object in modern English to uses of adverbs that have no li on the end of them, but in fact, in the history of English, there have been adverbs with no li on them all through its history. Fast is one of them. So it's not peculiar to say do it quick rather than do it quickly. So here we have an adjective, better, that in form could be matched to an adverb. The question is, what adverb was it, what matched to? Probably not sooner, because sooner wasn't used very frequently. Denison and Court suggest rather, since that was already being used modally. Van der Graaf, over 100 years ago, suggested had liever, would prefer, because liever there very clearly has to do with preference. Depends on what set you're looking at. But anyway, it does appear to have been analogized. And so by the end of Middle English, we get a new form, which is an adverb with a meaning that is a preference modal. That's why the had liever is an attractive model for the analogy. It appears mainly with would and should. There are few scattered examples with had in the 15th century. By the time you get to Shakespeare, there's only one example, which is interesting to compare with 60 had rather. So one had better, 60 had rather in Shakespeare. That suggests had better was not well established by about 1600. Thing that is really interesting about these three is that in the 15th century, if they occurred with a modal, whatever the modal was, would, should, had, rather, sooner, and better were all used as preference modals. So they were all essentially used in the same way, same meaning. Rather and sooner occurred with would and had. Better occurs with had in the 16th century, but as I said, it's rare. It did not become entrenched with had until the 18th century. It's used to express advisability in the 18th century, not preference. So it has changed two things, or speakers have changed two things by the time we get to the 18th century. For one, you've changed the meaning. No longer preference, it's now advisability. For another, the modal that collocates with it is had, not would or any of the other ones. So in 8, we have, I ordered my husband to come and fetch me home at such an hour, but he never came. But he had better have come, or I made him court me a whole week afterwards before I'd let him come to bed to me. So it would have been advisable for him to have come. So I propose that now we have a second constructionalization. The first one was from the adjective to the adverb with a preference meaning, and the second one was in the 18th century, a collocation with had and a new meaning, advisability modal. Now, better was established as a semi-modal later than rather and sooner, but it rapidly came to be used as the dominant semi-modal. It's far more frequent than rather sooner from the 18th century on. And in present-day English, it's the most reduced. The standard of comparison has been almost completely lost, and it is not often used. So you better go is more frequently said than you had better go, or you'd better go. One of the things that's interesting about this is that it is a counterexample to the hypothesis that older forms are likely to be more reduced than younger forms. It's a hypothesis that Bybee, Paluca, and Perkins, in that order, proposed in 1991 in a paper on development of future markers, future grams. So here is another counterexample to traditional ideas about grammaticalization. If you take a grammaticalization approach, you would expect better being the latest to be the least reduced. However, it is the most frequent and the most reduced. It's also more subjective, as it expresses personal opinion rather than social norms. That first example from Denison, a man had better, his son was this or that, is all about social norms. It's not about the speaker's preference. But now it's all about the speaker's preference. Van Linden, looking at the data, points to a kind for grammaticalization. She posits better, and then sooner, and then rather, on grounds of reduction of auxiliaries and reduction of than. She's thinking of grammaticalization as reduction. And if you look at the modals with which better, sooner, rather occur, it is clear that they do actually reduce in the order that she has specified there. Better, sooner, rather. Better is the most reduced, sooner, less reduced, and rather least reduced. But if you think of grammaticalization in terms of token frequency, as Bybee and some others have done, sooner has always been and continues to be the lowest in frequency, most likely to be ambiguous with its source, and it's the least bleached. And so it doesn't sit properly in that line of better, sooner, rather. But from a frequency point of view, I would say better, rather, sooner. So some evidence that it's the least bleached. When I was looking at examples of sooner, I found myself constantly being a little bit uncertain about whether I had a temporal reading or a preference reading. Now, I think this one does need to be a preference reading, but I could see a reason to think of a temporal reading. Safer than leaning over tall buildings to take photos of pedestrians, we know which we'd sooner do. Because, as I mentioned earlier, if you prefer to do something in a world where doing something fast is better than doing something slowly, there's always a kind of ambiguity when you say, we'd sooner do it, we do it first, and we do it by preference. So these two meanings sort of interfere with each other. In the case of sooner, they don't with rather, because rather has no temporal readings whatsoever, as far as I know, in modern English, but sooner does. So if you're doing a constructional analysis, of course you have to pay attention to reduction in form. It's there in the data, it has to be acknowledged. But focusing, in my view, focusing primarily on reduction of form misses some important points. One that I was most interested in is that in the 15th century, all of these semi-modals had preference semantics. Within the deontic necessity modal domain of prefer, favor, it's weak deontic, but still it's in that general area of modality. And as I mentioned, post-constructionalization as a preference semi-modal, better was reorganized. Better ceased to be used as a preference semi-modal and was incorporated in a different advice sub-schema of which advise and should are members. All are marginal in the grammaticalized modal system and somewhat distant in the network from both core modals and emerging modals. They're most distant from the core modals. They don't undergo auxiliary inversion. Don't think you can say, sooner he leave, which is a question of, does he prefer to leave sooner? May he leave is fine. May is the way, that is the way in which you do core modal interrogatives. May he leave, should he leave, must he leave? All of those, as you know, come first in an interrogative. But none of these do. The semi-modals are rather questionable here. Ought he to leave? Yes, probably, but it tends to be avoided. Dare he leave? Perhaps. Need he leave? Or do we do, does he dare to leave? Does he need to leave? But we don't do, does he ought to leave? We kind of avoid the question form with ought. So, how marginal are they? Rather and sooner collocate with other modals, wouldn't had. They may be used with a standard of comparison than. Neither of those features is typical of either core modals or the emerging modals. So they're very marginal in those respects. So is better, which collocates with had. But better ceased to be used with the standard of comparison than. And that made it somewhat closer to the core modals. There is, in fact, additional evidence that better is being conceptualized by some speakers or writers, at least, as closer than rather and sooner to Krug's hybrid set of dare to, need to, and ought to. One is something I've mentioned several times. It is frequently found without had or would. You better go now. You get do support when better is negated. You better don't go there without us. Now, it's true that in you needn't go and you don't need to go, the don't appears before the need, but at least in 10, you have don't occurring with better, which appears to be attempts to make a structure with a negation that is closer to the kinds of things that semi-auxiliaries can do. And this you may not be familiar with, but I thought was perfectly normal. I grew up in England. It's occasionally found with and no do support. Well, you better start staying in then, better'n't you? I recollect his beginning an interesting talk over early English upon a child saying to me, better'n't we go out now? I cited that in paper, and I'm fascinated by that example. Better'n't we go out now, where better is actually there in initial position? Like, shouldn't we go out now? Mustn't we do that? Some people wouldn't use mustn't. But certainly, mayn't we go now? Shouldn't we go now? Wouldn't they go out now? Those are all right as core modals. So better here was analogized by a child, according to Scott in 1887. It seems to be associated still with children's language. They are analogizing quite clearly to at least some aspects of the core modals. Another example, you stay here. I shifted, uncomfortable in his eyes. Better'n't you go? Better'n't you? I got some vinegar to rack off and you can help me most likely. This is clearly represented as dialectal, colloquial. You can see with the vinegar to rack off, that's partly lexical, and instead of end, so it's trying to represent colloquial local speech. Again, you got better'n't you, there's no verb there, but at least it shows criticization of nt. So better exemplifies a unit that is undergoing partial analogical matching to some hybrid semi-modals. And at the same time, it retains some of the characteristics of its earlier use and some distributional similarity to rather and sooner, such as its use with had. So if you look at what's happening here in terms of grammaticalization and constructionalization, you will see that in terms of grammaticalization, there has been morphosyntactic reduction, most significantly with respect to better. Van Linden is perfectly correct on that point. There has been reanalysis in the context of modal had, would, should, from temporal adverbial to modal in the cases of rather and sooner, and from adjective better in impersonal syntax to modal. In terms of constructionalization, those reanalyses can be thought, the reanalysis can be thought of as constructionalizations, and the various shifts in use of collocating auxiliaries before and after constructionalization as constructional changes, which I talked about last time. Pre-constructionalization modifications of context and post-constructionalization modification of context can be quite different. The early ones in these cases are various kinds of uses with modals like would, should, and had. Later constructional changes after the constructionalization are the reductions of had to ud and should and would to ud, so that we don't know which of those modals is intended. The loss of standard of comparison then is all post-constructionalization. Also, in terms of constructionalization, all show some increase in non-analyzability, sorry about the typo, with regard to adverbial status. So they become less obviously adverbial. Now, rather was an adverb, sooner was an adverb, better was not an adverb. Rather no longer appears to be a very good adverb. It is a perfectly good semi-modal, but not very clearly adverbial. Another point is that better shows increasing token productivity. As I said, it's becoming more and more frequently used. It is also showing increasing schematicity insofar as it is showing a shift toward distributional characteristics such as hybrid semi-modals like ought to, need to, and dare to have. This involves quite a bit of analyzation. And from a constructional perspective, the schema of semi-modals and modals is modified. It now begins to sanction more members as these three have come to be used as modals. Now, how about their status in terms of networks? In the first lecture, I cited Langacker. Constructions are linked in networks. And Goldberg so famously said that grammar should be an account of the network of constructions that captures our grammatical knowledge in toto. The in toto is subject to question, but the suggestion that our knowledge of language consists of a network of construction is not debated at all. It's assumed that our knowledge is mentally somehow represented in a neural network. Now, how to conceptualize networks and relations that constitute the network is a matter of considerable debate. We all agree that there's networks, but how do we think about them? Diesel 2019 has a book on the topic of networks, mainly with respect to acquisition and how children's acquisition of language shows evidence of development of more and more complex networks. And Sommer and Smirnova have an edited volume which focuses on diachronic changes in networks and how to think about those networks. There are two types of networks that are discussed these days, so-called vertical inheritance network that I'm going to talk about today, and also a so-called horizontal network that accounts for variation that I will talk about next time. So the basic network in Goldberg construction grammar model is a taxonomic inheritance network. It models increasing levels of abstractness, and it means that each node that is lower in a taxonomy has the properties of the immediately higher node. So any member of the modal construction, which roughly we can say is modal plus verb, is the form, linked to arealis, that's modality, and the semantics of a verb, will inherit the co-occurrence with the main verb and the semantics arealis. So you have a very abstract schema, which is a modal construction. And everything that is modal, that is a daughter of that modal construction, will have the features arealis, and they will have the form followed by a verb. And you don't have to repeat that all the way down in these particular kinds of models. So if you want to see what that looks like, it looks awfully like a traditional generative grammar tree, but it needs to be read in a different way. And I'm saying this in part because of a question that came up. What it's really conceptualized as by Goldberg and others is that you have constructs, you have and microconstructions, you have the actual pieces of language like must, ought to, should, better, rather, sooner, and may. And generalizations are made over them in acquisition, either by children or by young adults and older adults, which are thought of as somewhat higher level and ultimately very high level sets. So must and ought to belong to an obligation construction. Don't think anybody would deny that. And note that the date here is 1600. This is before you get the epistemic meanings of must and ought. So if you got must and you got ought to and generalize over them, and you say, oh, well, both of those really have to do with obligation. And there is also a weaker advice, should. And there's a weaker yet preference construction consisting of better rather than sooner. Now, the reason I put better in just regular Roman letters and font is that by 1600, as I've said many times, better had not really settled, or speakers had not settled, that's better in a usage model, speakers had not settled on what kind of modal would go with it. whereas rather was occurring with had and would and should, as was sooner, had and would and should. So the capitals rather and the capitals sooner mean that here's a microconstruction with several kinds of associated modals. So as you read this tree, unlike a generative tree where you read top down, from a construction grammar point of view, you read it up. So individual speakers meet here, members of these sets in conversation. Sorry. That's the right one. They generalize over them, so must and ought to, as I said. I really apologize, this is bad. Okay. Must and ought to are generalized over as a fairly strong obligation set within a large deontic construction which has many submembers. The three that I picked out here are obligation, advice, and preference. And those are all submembers of a larger abstract modal construction, which is essentially, as I said, abstract modal verb paired with irialis and the meaning of the verb. And there's another major subset, the epistemic constructions, which I've not spelled out in any detail here, but just note that they're there. So if I say you must go, that's an obligation. And if you say they may be going right now, that's the possibility one. Of course, there's also a may of permission that's over in the deontic domain. But I just wanted to flag that here we have deontic and epistemic in English. Whew. All right. So that was 1600. Fast forward to present day. Well, we've still got a modal construction and it's still quite rich. By now, we have an obligation construction, members of which are must and ought to, an advice construction, members of which are should and better, and a preference construction, which has become more constricted. It's got rather and sooner in it. And now the epistemic construction has greatly expanded because we not only have may, which has a deontic permission polysemy, but must is polysemous, so you must go, and that must be a problem where must is not an obligation, but I conclude that it's a problem. We've got ought to, which is you ought to do that, and someone's coming to the door and you can say that ought to be Bill, because I'm expecting it's Bill and I believe it is Bill, and so that's epistemic. And of course, should does the same thing. Should is, I advise you to do something, you should do that. And again, we can have, that should be Mary at the door, right? So what we have is the deontic sub schema of the modal construction with some reorganized subsets in the advice and preference domains and a very largely expanded epistemic construction. This is very partial, just giving an example of how these networks can be thought about with the data that I have been investigating. So there's been, as I said, reorganization of the membership of the subschemas. But I think we can say that better rather than sooner continue to be partially motivated in relation to their members. This is particularly clear with respect to form. And so they can be said to form a family of partially related semi-modals in the constructional network. But they do not form an integrated subschema anymore. And if I can capture, yes, what I mean by an integrated subschema is this, that they all belong to preference, and they no longer do. So, in part, my analysis converges with van Linden's analysis. She points out, and has to point out, better diverged from rather and sooner in the 18th century. That is indisputable. It is indisputable that there has been significant erosion of types of collocating modals and frequency of use. There's no question about that. Totally agree. As I said at the beginning, van Linden posits the decline better, sooner, rather, in that order, on grounds of reduction of collocating auxiliaries. There's none with better in some uses. There's ud from had and would with rather and sooner. And there's more reduction of these collocating auxiliaries with sooner than with rather. But as I mentioned earlier, from a constructional perspective, sooner is the least token productive, most likely to be potentially ambiguous, the temporal sooner, so seems to be the least crystallized as a construction. Now, van Linden concludes that all three are overall developing in the same direction. Yes, in terms of reduction, that is true. But I conclude that better is diverging from rather and sooner and being used in less marginal ways. It is being partially analogized to the emerging hybrid modal system outlined in Krug. And the reason I do that is that construction grammar thinks about analogy in a way that has not been traditional in grammaticalization studies. As I mentioned, for a very long time, analogy was considered not to be a very serious competitor in thinking about language change. And Christian Lehmann in 2004 talked about pure grammaticalization without analogy. That was a mindset, that grammaticalization does not involve analogy. That was overturned by Olga Fischer. This is repeating what I said the other day. I'm accounting for why it is that we have this, van Linden and I have these rather different points of view looking at the same data. The constructional data is going to look at analogy, it's going to look at schemas, it's going to look at sets, which she wasn't doing because she was working in well-grounded, very traditional way of thinking about grammaticalization. So by way of conclusion, the interpretations that I've outlined, I think, complement and enrich each other. I would suggest that looking at meaning in modal networks as well as form gives us a fuller perspective. It hopefully comes closer to what English-speaking interlocutors' knowledge of the semi-modals may have been like over time. I think it's worth pulling out this quote from Winning and Bowie when we're thinking about the history of relationships between grammaticalization and constructionalization. They're talking about morphology. And they say, from a diachronic point of view, it's not the status of the grammaticalizing item that is interesting. Is it a word or an affixoid or already an affix? What is worthy of note is the emergence of a new construction, a new constructional subschema and its place within the network of constructions. Now, that in some sense is fighting words for a person who is studying grammaticalization. I would claim that both of those are worthy of note. What is worthy of note is indeed the status of the grammaticalizing element and also its position in a constructional schema. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Both grammaticalization and constructionalization approaches are needed if we're really going to understand what's going on in our data when the data overlaps. That is, when the data involves new procedural uses. So next time, I'm going to talk about something that has really nothing whatsoever to do with grammaticalization, but is a very standard example of the sort of data that constructionists think about. It's the alternation of give someone something and give something to someone, and the network relationships therein. This could not and would not be the topic of grammaticalization analysis. So that's for next time. So thank you. I look forward to questions, comments, and I should add challenges. I really enjoy challenges. So if you have counter arguments, I welcome them. Let's have a couple of minutes break and I will be back to see what's in the chat box.